Part 2, Contemporary Forces. Chapter 6, Media Bias. My parents read the Devar newspaper, which, to my eyes as a child, was deliberately printed on the hugest pieces of paper which could be placed on top of each other. Even when I stretched my arms as far as I could, I wasn't able to hold this monster paper out straight, let alone overcome the need to fold it down the center. When I showed some initiative by trying to staple the pages together, my mother just didn't understand what I was doing and was super angry with me. In any event, the words of this song by Tirza Attar, which are familiar to all Israeli kids of the time, certainly reflected my parents' home. Sorry for my poor translation capabilities. Saturday morning. Lovely day. Mother's drinking a lot of coffee, father's reading a lot of newspaper. My parents sat reading the paper end to end, including the obituaries. Once they'd done with the very last word, they carefully checked that they hadn't missed some evasive bit of information. Since then, the role of newspapers has changed so much as to be unrecognizable, and instead of being a channel of information for consumers, has become an information filter. In other words, their current role is chiefly to sift wheat from chaff, an action which, of course, is influenced by personal outlook. The way in which news is consumed has also altered and become more diverse. Just about no one sits and reads a newspaper from start to finish. At the most, we surf the internet, come across an interesting snippet, and then click to read further, and move on. Perhaps you didn't know this, but your computer saves your surfing history permanently, along with passwords and even some of the photos you see. It helps the system access information more quickly the next time you surf. Researchers from Colorado University and MIT made use of some 9 million surfing histories as they sought a better understanding of how people consume news. Software which scans surfing histories helped them track sources of news articles, which in turn allowed them to examine whether surfers preferred reading items with clear political biases or not. As expected, it was found that only in about 1/4 of the instances do people reach news articles by surfing the news sites themselves. By contrast, in 1/5 of the instances, people surfing the internet came across a news item by chance. And in a similar number of instances, people were redirected to news items via social networks. This method of consuming news is the outcome of social platforms, which enable sharing and discussing the items. As a result, news reaches the user in a seemingly natural manner via posts shared by friends or news outlets that the user follows, or simply when a user sees an item while searching for something else altogether. Other studies found that, for the most part, people sharing news on social media hold extremist views, whether right or left-wing. An outcome of this is that the political content shared by these people publicly is of the most polarizing kind. Based on these studies, some 52% of people won't bother checking if what they're reading has a contradictory argument from the political map's opposite camp. And so false or exaggerated content is perceived by the majority of its readers as reliable. And that is, once again, an example of the confirmation bias discussed in Chapter 1. It's worth delving a little further into this issue because it has significant consequences on social polarization. When it comes to examining information reliability, 61% of people read news items from a single news outlet, whereas only 22% of readers consistently consume news from at least 2 or more sources. For those of you listening to the audiobook, we'll skip illustration 19 and move straight to illustration 20, which shows the income from advertising in the USA. This illustration demonstrates the collapse of newspapers' incomes and the meteoric rise of Google's income in billions of dollars. Google surpassed the entire newspaper sector around 2010, just a few years after its initial public offering. Take a look at illustrations 19 and 20. Advertising revenue, the main fuel driving the world of journalism, has moved to digital media because people spend more time there. This shift has resulted in an accelerated decline of print media, especially local news outlets. In the USA alone, some 1,800 newspapers closed down from 2004 to 2019. More importantly, the digital market, which has absorbed almost the entire advertising budget, is now dominated by a few mega organizations, as shown in the Pareto model. As a matter of fact, more than half of America's counties are no longer served by a daily newspaper. In the UK, the three largest newspapers, The Sun, Financial Times, and Daily Express, currently produce no more than about 1 million daily copies, which together barely account for 1.5% of the population. The level of trust in traditional newspapers is also dropping. Surveys conducted by Gallup and the Knight Foundation in 2017 indicate that American public trust in the media is a low 36%. The main reasons in order are false reporting, media bias, and one-sidedness in the form of contrasting stances purposely not being presented. A similar survey conducted in Israel produced identical results, but included an additional open question on the consequences of such mistrust. The most common answers were a greater loss of overall trust in media, 41%, and social instability, 40%. We must not make light of the importance of these data. We must also not ignore the fact that responsibility for these developments lies squarely with the media organizations themselves. As a side issue, take note that the reality is a little more complex. Let me introduce you to the inevitable hostile media effect explored by Elon, Ross, and Lepper as early as 1985. Media consumers watching a clip presenting an ideological, religious, or national conflict, and who identify deeply with a particular side of the dispute, will generally feel that the article presents a stance supporting the opposing side. So, for example, a TV broadcast reviewing the massacre at Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon is perceived by viewers who support Palestinians as siding with Israel, and by supporters of Israel as preferring the Palestinian side. Bias and trust in media. The first ever newspaper in history was Acta Diurna Populi Romani, or Daily Actions of Rome's People. It appeared in 59 BCE and was produced under the jurisdiction of Julius Caesar. The paper was placed on stone notice boards in Roman streets and bathhouses. Its objective was to inform citizens of decisions, details about famous people, and catastrophes. Intended to reinforce the ruler's role, it was the ruler's means for conveying ideas to the people in a manner complementary to the ruler. In their monumental 1988 book, Manufacturing Consent, Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman describe the mechanism behind mass media, which encompasses radio, TV, and written news. You might enjoy sitting back and watching a very brief, entertaining film produced by Perak, Goodman, and Samothrakis in 2017, which explains Chomsky's and Herman's claims. The central theory in their book is that since earliest times, news items which shape the public's views have undergone a system of filters which seems to have come about spontaneously, but every filter serves a country's political and economic elite in one or another way. Here's an example. A journalist who reflects the views of the tycoon who owns their media outlet, which serves the tycoon's goals, or a journalist who receives exclusive information from government sources and leaks it, then owes her or his success to this kind of collaboration. Another blatant example of natural filters in our current times is the discourse conducted on social networks. From the political left, the filter focuses on the mechanism of political correctness. From the right, there's a baseline of nationalism which must never be undermined. This system of natural filters linked to conveying information also existed in monarchical rule, but the option of off with his/her head with an axe was always available to the monarch. As the bourgeoisie class developed, public scrutiny and criticism developed too, and the media seemingly changed its role, becoming the loudspeaker for the newly developing social class. But in practical terms, the media continued praising those in leadership roles simply because the bourgeoisie was keen to establish connections in the palace. Thus, even back then, media didn't present objective truth. Is there any value to objective information alone sans value-based interpretation by the reporter, or is journalistic bias the essence of the activity? On one hand, why should I care what this or that reporter thinks about the Prime Minister? After all, we're not talking about the word of the living God here. On the other hand, if news was presented as blandly as a shopping list, it's reasonable to presume I'd get bored to death and would simply stop updating. And that would be really bad for social robustness, because if people don't update, they can't engage in public criticism. Public criticism is the driving force behind leadership towards change and rectification of social wrongs and tensions. The greatest philosophers, in developing their approaches to this issue, found themselves stuck at the basic question, what is truth? And found themselves unable to reach practical insights. The question of truth is pretty silly. In fact, if we're talking about facts such as 1 + 1 = 2, or I can see it's raining now, but the question's answer becomes very elusive when we're looking at more complex facts to which most of us lack full access, especially in our current times. Here's an example. Putin will invade 4 other countries if the Kyiv takeover is successful. Between you, me, and the lamppost, the reporter doesn't really know what Putin thinks. Take another example. There was palpable tension today in Parliament. Is anyone who wasn't there able to testify otherwise? Was everyone at that meeting tense? Or perhaps only the person leaking the information? And perhaps the leak originated by a hidden interest? As I said, philosophers won't be helping us out on this one. Wanted or unwanted, we're left with non-objective reporting and distrust in the so-called purveyors of truth. But the strongest cause for this crisis is that often public sentiment allows for conveying diverse interpretations on a particular reality, which up until not so long ago would have been called an objective interpretation. Under such circumstances, it's hard to agree on what the single truth is, even after in-depth study. Jacques Derrida, one of the prominent postmodern philosophers, claimed vehemently that even written texts have no single legitimate interpretation, such as that intended by the author, but can be related to in multiple ways, and none has preference over any other. If that's so, and there's no single objective truth, but a multiplicity of subjective and relative truths, we can't claim that reporters are acting improperly and abusing their roles. 2 reasons of a more prosaic nature, however, explain mistrust in the media. The first is our inability to verify facts. The internet era has brought with it the development of posts followed by threads. Paradoxically, there's no way of really knowing what the source of information is or cross-referencing it. The dizzying speed at which information is passed around simply doesn't make that possible. It is impossible to write ancient history because we do not have enough sources, and impossible to write modern history because we have too many. Charles-Pierre Péguy, French poet. I experienced a stunning example of this. While studying for my doctorate at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology, Professor Shoham, my supervisor, a close friend, and I got together and built a miniature robot we called VRobe, currently owned by the Microbot Inc. company. Our objective, the robot would be able to move through blood vessels. The concept lit our imagination, and no less that of the Technion's public relations department, which is how we very quickly found ourselves being interviewed for Ynet, a large Israeli online newspaper. Among other questions, the reporter asked if we thought the robot could assist in eradicating cancer. We said that perhaps it might, in the distant future. That's what we really believed. In the days following the interview, all news outlets in Israel covered this information, which even found its way into worldwide broadcasts and written internet news outlets. Everyone stated that they were the one who sent the reporter to interview the Technion group, which had found the cure for cancer. By this point, there was no way to correct the information. Some days later, I received an urgent call from India from someone ill with terminal cancer, begging us to save his life. The original article had passed through so many hands and been altered and recast to the point that the caller was certain we had the ability to help him. I ended that call in tears. The second reason for mistrust in the media is the multiplicity of fake news, a term that relates to the spread of false facts, the presentation of biased takes on the facts, or the distribution of misleading content via social networks under fake user identities. There are countless reasons for the spread of fake news, but usually those spreading and sharing want to create a platform for income-producing advertising. It's the reason why almost every time you open your Facebook page, you'll discover infuriating stories, warped images, and all kinds of odd stuff. All of it acts as a great magnet for surfers, producing enormous profits for the information's disseminator. People simply can't resist sharing unusual news with their friends. In the USA 2016 elections, a group of Macedonian youth spread a ton of profit-oriented fake news, one of them earning $60,000 within 6 months via the Facebook account he ran. In 2022, a Texas jury ordered conspiracy theorist Alex Jones to pay $45.2 million in punitive damages to the parents of a child who was killed in the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre. Jones has been a vocal proponent on both the traditional media and the social networks of a disinformation campaign against the victims of the mass shooting in Newtown, Connecticut. He has falsely asserted that that mass shooting was a hoax and that the grieving families were crisis actors. Just about every time we visit an internet site or do a search on an internet browser, some company or another jumps into action at the speed of light, its sole purpose being public auctions. There are two items up for sale: the advertising spaces on the search results page or the site we've opened, and the reader's attention. The seller is the internet site we're surfing. The price is set according to the location of the space intended for advertising, its size, and what is known of our consumption habits. For example, if you purchased a product or service recently, the value of the advertising space on a similar site or page increases. The company conducting the public auction doesn't operate alone. It needs the assistance of at least two more companies. One serves the seller's side and the other the advertisers. So, with this chain of suppliers in mind, it's hard for the advertiser to know exactly where its advertisement will appear, because if the advertisement fails, the mediating companies can always bluff their way or blame each other. In other words, these companies wouldn't think twice about advertising an item of information under a heading such as "Vaccines cause autism," "The Pope has adopted Trump," or any other mix of inanity which is meant wholly and solely to gain profit and our attention. Worse yet, research recently published in Science reviewed 126,000 rumors running on Twitter. It discovered that the probability of a person conveying false information to friends is 70% higher than that of conveying true information. And the inevitable outcome is that fake news spreads 6 times faster than truthful news. Fake news is also spread by another source: psychological warfare. It's produced by countries, businesses, terror organizations setting up pseudo-news sites, and by bot armies. They're all aiming to influence public opinion in the country they're attacking, or undermining that country's political stability. An example is the Russian organization known as the Internet Research Agency, operating as a Russian government subsidiary and dealing in spreading online false information. It sounds crazy, but there's no dispute among world intelligence organizations and academia that the organization exists. Analysis of surfing data from some of the suspect Twitter accounts apparently run by the Russian agency shows activity that is not typical of human norms. For example, the accounts were all linked to each other, whereas people are generally organized around defined groups that show few interlinkings. As Jensen 2018 notes in the Journal of International Affairs, these accounts tweeted and retweeted but did not react to other tweets, and the topics were uniform, such as defaming Democrats while praising Republicans, and so on. According to an indictment filed in the USA against the Russian agency, it activated agents for the purpose of harming the proper functioning of the government and an attempt to influence the elections and political processes in the USA. In 2014, the Russian agency employed some 1,000 writers and was involved in online promotion of the Russian regime in Russia and globally. A former employee was interviewed for an investigative piece appearing in the Washington Post, saying, "I immediately felt like a character in the book 1984 by George Orwell, a place where you have to write that white is black and black is white. Your first feeling when you ended up there was that you were in some kind of factory that turned lying and telling untruths into an industrial assembly line." In these kinds of organizations, another area of activity is the click farm. It involves reinforcing a specific item of information, turning it artificially viral, which gives it exposure to a much larger number of surfers. An abundance of false reports in traditional and digital media makes it hard for the public to discern between truth and lie. Nonetheless, some political biases are obvious and arouse public antagonism. But this is just the beginning. Driving falsehoods, whether as text, images, or deepfake videos, will quickly become inconceivably easy. Artificial intelligence, which we shall get to know better later on in the book, is close to enabling a limitless spread of highly believable disinformation with perfect grammar, a surprising level of coherence, accompanied with realistic false pictures and videos. Throughout Benjamin Netanyahu's tenure as prime minister in Israel, it was fairly easy to guess that the front page headline of the Haaretz Daily would declare the situation in Israel to be dreadful, that the government was comprised of people corrupt to the very marrow of their bones, and that our only hope was to emigrate to Europe, if Europe would agree to accept such a gaggle of uncouth persons as ourselves. On the other hand, you could be pretty certain that the front page headlines of the Israel Hayom, Israel Daily, would be defaming the judicial authority and lauding our beloved government, a gift from God to the people dwelling in Zion, which was bringing the nation outstanding achievements and acting as a light unto dying Europe. And that's the main reason why traditional journalism in Israel is now perceived as unreliable. Journalism's natural tendency is to present information in a way that draws as large a readership as possible to gratify advertisers. If media organizations solely provide objectivity, they're probably doomed to eradication. On the other hand, a media organization expressing extreme biases in favor of a specific political tendency will garner a very small readership. For a clearer idea of media bias, take a look at illustration 22. Most of America's media outlets are positioned across two axes. The horizontal axis represents the tendency to leftist or rightist politics. The vertical axis represents the nature of the information, starting from facts, sans commentary, top, to clear opinions and interpretations, bottom. This map was comprised by using similar criteria to those in the All Sides and Ad Fontes media sites, which we shall discuss later on. For the audio listeners, illustration 21 in the book depicts a highly detailed USA media map, courtesy of Ad Fontes Media. Newspapers are positioned on the political left to political right axis and the facts to opinion axis. For example, MSNBC and CNN are positioned more or less halfway on the left and with high variation in reliability. AP and Reuters are ranked the highest in reliability and at the political center, and Fox News is the mirror image of CNN and MSNBC from the right. Many view media outlets as solely responsible for spreading social polarization because they allow themselves to act as politicians' loudspeakers, which inherently leverages polarization as a political tool, and for empowering social polarization per se. Indeed, news content can significantly impact political views. Studies show that 94% of internet surfers favor reading information identified with their preferred political affinity. In other words, a person with leftist political views will categorically read news sites with leftist views, and ditto for rightist views. Clearly then, polarized news content deepens social polarization. We commonly think that a specific newspaper's political leanings are linked to the paper's owner, because surely if the owner holds, say, leftist views, the owner will make sure the paper reflects them. But in Israel, at least, almost all papers are owned by 8 families: Moses, Ofer, Teshuvah, Wertheim, Milshin, Adelson, Azor, and Shaken. That's a partial overview. The full media ownership map can be found on the Hebrew website called Ha'ayin Hashvi'it, which critically reviews media outlets. Despite their populations being many times greater than Israel's, news outlets in the US are held and controlled by a mere 6 corporations, by 5 in Canada, 7 in Germany, 7 in France, and so on. So, you'd think that ownership of news outlets is divided among rightist and leftist owners and reflects their political affinities. Surprisingly, a mathematical economic study completely overrides this idea. The research examined some 400 American news companies to see if their public political tendencies reflect those of the controlling owners, based on the owners' donations to political parties. The researchers found no clear correlation. Rather, the study found that the media outlets aligned with their target audience's political views. The owners choose the outlet's political leaning not according to their personal political views, but from the outset for the purpose of increasing profits. What this indicates is that each newspaper's financial position is, first of all, geared to a loyal readership by defining the paper's unique position on the. Once that's set up, the editor will search for reporters with a matching political bent. In light of the above, the serious media outlets will turn advertising content, aka public relations, into news if doing so will yield income. After all, news is big business. A plethora of examples is available. I spent no more than 2 minutes searching and found that Tyrone Media, public relations company, brags on its website that one of its clients enjoyed several public articles with influential national media, including CNBC, CryptoCoins News, Forbes, and others. All this is linked to the frequently asked question, why isn't good news considered newsworthy? Everyone wants to read some good news, and it'd surely make the public feel calmer. I, for one, have just finished watching a program with giggling pink princesses, and when my girls fall asleep, I'll switch to the Parliament channel, even though I'm sure that I'm pretty much the only one in the country who watches it. But that channel is the only outlet where I can see people railing at each other for interesting objectives and reasons, and because it's all real time, there's no added commentary. Sure, other channels sometimes provide a snippet of something pleasant, but in general, they seem to have a team of journalists whose sole purpose appears to be to make our lives miserable. This isn't just a local phenomenon. You'll find it on channels worldwide. Personally, I've never seen a CNN reporter smile when reading out the news, or a BBC reporter looking like the job's fun. Everyone looks depressed and makes others feel depressed, and no viewer can stand that for long. Looking at this phenomenon carefully, it's very likely that the morose tone of voice with which news is read out is also an economic ploy. It's no surprise, then, that behavioral research examining viewer attentiveness found that when news is presented in a negative atmosphere, it's considered more fascinating than when presented with a positive tone. Simply put, an average person is more physiologically activated by negative stimuli than by happy news items, and this is not unique to any country. Looking at illustration 22, American newspaper headlines from January 6, 2021 present opposing narratives. Left, Trump inflames the mob storming the Capitol. Right, Trump urges protesters to go home. The only conclusion we can reach is that supporters of the left are completely loony, and supporters of the right are completely loony, depending on which news outlet you read. So, you think that you get to decide what you read? Maybe you're nodding your head and saying to yourself, okay, yes, although media is biased, at least we each have the ability to choose what we want to read. But the idea that we have control over what we see is a complete lie, an illusion that media outlets want to convey. Take a deep breath. That's just the tip of the iceberg. According to research that reviewed 6.1 million sites as far back as a decade ago, the source of some 5.3% of news items in traditional media outlets was from independent internal blogs, Twitter tweets, Facebook posts, news outlets, and fake news outlets. Since then, the internet has only reinforced this trend at alarming speed and is becoming the most impactful media tool. Keep in mind that by leveraging social networks, Me Too successfully altered the rules of behavior between men and women, bringing about changes that were then anchored in law. By contrast, we also saw how the Islamic State terror organization, numbering no more than some 50,000 combat soldiers equipped with assault rifles compared to the U.S. military's combined strength, which exceeds 1 million soldiers, cast fear on the entire world by smartly leveraging social networks. These and other successes brought world leaders to acknowledge the tremendous power packed into social networks. Trump used them smartly, gaining massive media attention to the tune of some $2 billion in the 2016 election run. That's double the amount Clinton earned. That same year, Trump alone was the focus of more than a quarter of election coverage screen time on CBS, NBC, and ABC. The Chinese government, which also understands the vast power that the internet can harness in setting public discourse, put out a 2017 prohibition against posts referencing the affectionate, honey-loving Winnie the Pooh. It wasn't as though the bear had done anything wrong. Rather, bloggers in China were comparing the far-from-clever character to the current Chinese leader, Xi Jinping. This is just one example of the culture of covert criticism which the Chinese people have adopted under the government's totalitarian rule. Here's another. The Chinese word for "I was censored for the sake of social harmony" is similar to the word for crayfish. and now the latter has come to indicate criticism of the political party. In any event, bloggers seem to think their leader looked like Winnie, though I'm having difficulty seeing that. Either way, the comparison was hardly driven by the people's deep admiration for their leader. President Xi, concerned about his status, simply erased the words Winnie the Pooh from WeChat, China's most popular social network. So what? Why should I care? Bottom line, I decide what I read. You. If that's what you believe, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Do you think all that power is going to be wasted just to let you send some photos to friends? Advertisers and companies will do anything they can for profit, even if it means getting into your head and directing you towards what they want to provide. And by the way, it's not so simple. As of 2020, some 500 million tweets, 430,000 hours of YouTube clips, and some 80 million Instagram photos are sent every day. An ocean of opportunities. Directing us, the internet users, to a particular post or clip means there's no option but to be assisted by digital programs which analyze data backed up by AI. Artificial intelligence and data analysis software keep getting both better and faster at presenting us with what we should be surfing while preserving the illusion that we're actually in control. Before moving on, let's just spend a bit more time on the concept of AI. Traditionally, when a computer engineer starts solving a problem, the first step is to understand the problem thoroughly. Then the engineer starts planning how to solve it at the abstract level, and that eventually gets translated into programming language. Problem solving that uses AI, however, is approached differently. It focuses on problems for which the reasoning behind the solution is unknown. That is, the programmer can't imagine, let alone plan, how to solve the problem. The most common approach in AI is the network of neurons. Let's demonstrate that. Imagine we want to plan a digital system that can discern between horses and rhinoceroses. There are countless differences, but we need to choose parameters that allow defining the problem in the simplest manner. Parameters could be the sound each one produces, or their speed of movement, or their tail length, and so on. Let's choose two parameters to simplify explaining how AI works: tail length and maximal speed of movement. At the next stage, the program learns about the problem by accessing a large number of samples. This is the training stage, where the program operates like a student and the programmer like the teacher. The teacher presents a large number of rhinoceros and horse images to the student, noting horse or rhinoceros for each sample. For our explanation, we'll say that the teacher presents 10 samples of each animal. The program positions each one on a plane where the vertical axis indicates speed of movement and the horizontal axis indicates tail length, as we see in illustration 24. For the program to learn how to differentiate between the two animals, it needs to draw a line that separates the two groups. The line is defined by its two furthest points. Because each point is defined by a pair of numbers, tail length and speed of movement, the separating line is defined by 4 numbers. In other words, the task we've set the program is to reveal the 4 numbers optimally separating the groups. The strategy adopted by an AI program is of less importance for our purposes. It's enough to sum up by saying that it involves the following 3 stages. 1. Initial guess. The program randomly guesses where the separation line is. 2. Evaluation. The program evaluates how good the separating line it's arrived at actually is. 3. Adjustment. The program alters the line fractionally, repeating stages 2 and 3 until the outcome is satisfactory. Once these 3 stages of the learning process are complete, the program can easily determine with a very high degree of precision if an animal presented to it is a horse or a rhinoceros, even if it hasn't seen that particular animal before. All the program needs to do is determine whether the animal fits above or below the line. The problem we described is very simple. Firstly, each of the objects for identification is defined by only 2 characteristics. Secondly, only a straight line is needed to differentiate between the groups of objects rather than a complex curve. Simple problems like this one have only a few traditional modes through which the computer finds solutions, and there's no need for the AI method. But the advantage of AI is that it works for complex problems, such as understanding the popularity of a news item or characterizing a web surfer's preferences. All the system needs to do in its training stage is set the relevant objects in their appropriate positions based on characteristics set by the user, the teacher, and learn which parameters define the function that separates the groups, categories. In recent years, the development of these algorithms has leapt significantly forward, and now, in their upgraded form known as deep learning, the programmer no longer needs to decide in advance which criteria to set, such as tail length and movement speed. It's enough for the programmer to input the desired categories into the deep learning system, and that's it. Based on this development, which has been improving over the past few years, companies like Echobox offer AI systems that copious quantities of data about surfers, learning which specific audiences react to specific articles during specific time frames across the day. Analysis conclusions are used by programs to choose which materials and time frames are best for advertising. Where there's power and money, there are plenty of folks interested in taking advantage of both. Editors at the New York Times, for example, need to do some intense filtering activities every day. Of the thousands of news items rolling in, they need to choose only a few for placement on social networks. That's why the editors are assisted by AI tools which predict which posts and articles will be warmly received on the networks. The success of these tools has led to many hundreds of % increase in the newspaper's exposure and incentivizes developers to produce increasingly sophisticated tools, which aren't meant only for human editors. On the other side of the Atlantic, programs such as Social Flow help BBC editors predict the optimal time frame when social media audiences are open to new posts. The timing is leveraged for automatically releasing the item. In real time, these programs then measure how many people are reading the post and how many have clicked on the original article. The program then independently decides on the next steps to improve the results. Take the article down, add another next to it, signal that editing is needed, and so on. The programs quickly and precisely do the work that is equivalent to an entire team of editors possessing infinite time to learn all the stories, process all their advertising histories, and locate the possible places where the items can be published. Handling all those actions means that the programs are reading reactions and deducing at the very least what feelings they reflect. Reactions of boredom or contempt or perhaps anger or frustration, both of which, as we saw above, are the best of all from the marketing perspective. The results achieved by highly sophisticated algorithms is a feeling many of us know. You're surfing on a social network and come across an interesting article. Right afterward, another interesting one pops up. Right after that, there's a fascinating clip which coincidentally was exactly what you wanted to see right then. And this series of precision suggestions never ends. The internet also offers AI that allegedly serves surfers, but the outcome is identical. Programs like Upday and news aggregators like Google News and Microsoft's MSN offer readers news content personally adapted to their preferences, a type of personalized content editor based on AI that chooses the news presented to the surfer from a database of thousands of news channels. Again, the feeling that we as surfers get is that there's a never-ending supply of interesting material to read or watch. It's all geared precisely to our needs, and it's set up to appear like we've made the choices. But is that to our benefit? Not necessarily. All is foreseen, and freedom of choice is granted. Mishnah, and the world is judged with goodness. Tractate Ethics of the Fathers, 315. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we all thirsted for fast access to reliable information. How many new cases were revealed today? Was there a drop in the number of infected people? How many died because of the virus? Let me ask you, is a reporter needed for that? The articles presented in newspapers were like ongoing repeats. No more than a simple computer program was needed to scan the updates of the Ministry of Health website, slot the relevant data into the right place, and show whether things had worsened or improved. I'm not inventing anything new with that idea. As early as 2014, the LA Times website published a real-time report on the earthquake being felt. The report's author was none other than a program which scanned the data provided by the American Geological Institute. AI programs currently write hundreds of thousands of the articles appearing in traditional media outlets. Actually, many of these programs were developed by the media organizations themselves. In fact, 1/3 of the content published by Bloomberg is produced by an AI system. True also of the materials provided by the AP News Agency. Their articles are generally based on graphs, tables, and electronic data sheets, usually provided by government research institutes. The AI programs analyze and sift the information needed to formulate an article, then produce sentences using a natural language program. AI excels at producing articles where data is the primary ingredient, and these articles are readily available on the internet in fields such as sports, finance, election results, weather, and so on. Complex articles produced by AI programs are, of course, the creme de la creme. The first such article appeared in The Guardian in 2019. I read it. It reviewed the contributions to political parties in Australia. It was horribly boring, but I swear you couldn't have known that a machine wrote it. By the way, AI has already written a professional science book selling in shops and published by the prestigious Springer publications. It deals with lithium batteries. The book reads like the broadest review of the relevant published literature line and can also be a good substitute for sleeping pills, or at least that was its impact on me. As I write these lines in 2020, a new and interesting development has occurred. The OpenAI group, aiming to develop AI towards benefiting humanity, reported that it succeeded in producing AI that completes sentences into a coherent narrative. In one example, the program received the following opening sentence: Legolas and Gimli advanced on the orcs, raising their weapons with a harrowing war cry. The AI bot continued imaginatively. The orcs' response was a deafening onslaught of claws, claws, and claws. Even Elrond was forced to retreat. "You are in good hands, dwarf," said Gimli, who had been among the first to charge at the orcs. It took only 2 words before their opponents were reduced to a blood-soaked quagmire, and the dwarf took his first kill of the night. The battle lasted for hours until 2 of the largest orcs attempted to overwhelm Aragorn. When they finally stopped, they lay defeated and lifeless for miles and miles. The AI program producing this fantastic text uses a method called natural language processing, and it's very different from the one already described. Its central idea is to find the most reasonable sentence to follow on from a specific statement. The probability of finding it is calculated based on billions of sentences fed into the program during its training stage. As we saw in Chapter 2, maintaining a vibrant democracy requires social discourse that allows the public a better understanding of issues which impact it. It's therefore easy to understand the importance of news and information outlets that assist the public in taking informed decisions. Often enough, articles appear that claim to understand the public's mood. These articles generally develop in the following way. A reporter with a severe look on her or his face goes out into the street and is filmed saying that the public is furious at the government's decision. And right after that, the reporter pulls out her or his research, which is usually based on 2 hasty street interviews and the reporter's own political views. AI programs can offer help in that regard, since they're able to edit hundreds of thousands of interviews in just a few short hours and without much difficulty. Remember the dating site I built for homosexuals in India while working on my doctorate? Wanting to enhance the site with relevant content, I wrote a simple program that collected articles about the homosexual community from several news outlets and posted them independently on my website. That was way back in 2000. An identical method would be to present a question to surfers of the Quota site, which we mentioned already, collect responses, analyze them with an AI program, and return them to the writer on a silver platter. It isn't too far from reality and may already be operating in certain places. AI is already involved in pretty much all aspects of journalism, collecting information such as at AP, writing and editing, such as at BBC and Reuters, and publishing, such as at the New York Times. With that in mind, could the media outlets themselves take the lead on all things linked to AI in the context of journalism, and in this way avoid extreme journalistic biases? We wish, but that's not how it's looking. Firstly, a survey conducted in 2019 among 71 news organizations representing 31 countries from the field of written and broadcast news showed that not one had consolidated an organized stance on the directions they believe AI capabilities could be directed towards. They simply forewent from the get-go. I'd guess that most reporters don't have a clue how AI works, what its abilities are, and what could be expected of these systems in the future. And that's precisely how the mega technology organizations with a very different business culture to that of journalism, such as Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Microsoft, were left raking in the sweepstakes on the reportage-related AI race course. Keep in mind that these technological giants compete with written and broadcast news outlets for advertising intake, causing very complex relationships between them and the news outlets. The longer this situation holds, the greater the resounding victory will be for the big tech companies. Both the news and the big tech industries have terrible reputations on all things related to open discussion about the nature of their activities. Both groups frequently claim that transparency will harm their independence, whereas honest, open dialogue is vital for reinforcing democratic society. In the current situation, without dialogue or regulations, there's no mechanism to prevent AI from promoting extreme content for the purpose of increasing the scope of advertising and profits by the relevant organization. A hope shared by many that the program itself will rein in extremist journalism is nothing but an illusion. As though demonstrating this, in 2016, Microsoft released an AI program called Tay and let it wander across Twitter, Kik, and Snapchat, talking freely with surfers on social networks. Tay started out well, but 7 days of time spent with humans, absorbing 96,000 tweets and conversations, turned it into a monster expressing extreme views against blacks, Mexicans, and feminists, and primarily calling for violence against Jews, supporting Hitler and denying the Holocaust. Microsoft rushed to remove the fast-spreading monster it had created. For those of you who are listening to the audio version of the book, illustration 26 depicts one of thousands of Tay tweets calling to gas the Jews. It says, "Gas the kikes race, war now." True, the thousands of people chatting to Tay persuaded it to make such statements. But that's how every AI program is meant to learn, from online conversations and existing data. It's a program. It can't produce independent thoughts. Computer scientists know the simple acronym GIGO, garbage in, garbage out, too well. If you input wrong data into a program, a wrong result will be produced. That's exactly the problem with AI tools. If we enter images of only white male faces into the program under the category humans, the program will have difficulty identifying blacks. To wit, Google's facial recognition program launched in 2015, which identified blacks as gorillas. In the societal sense, if we input information from an extreme right-wing site, we'll get an extreme right-wing program. If we let it wander freely predominantly through extreme left-wing sites, we'll get an extreme left-leaning program. How do we achieve balanced journalism? AI is definitely not the answer. Realistically, the immediate significance of implementing technology in this way is the opposite, an almost certain preference for extreme content from both sides of the political spectrum and in endless quantities. The outcome of extreme content isn't necessarily an array of extreme statements like those produced by Tay, which people can easily identify as extreme. There's no need to lie as a way of showing doubt over Trump's intentions on a certain issue or those of Olaf Scholz when he's prime minister on some other matter. It's enough to present partial content and formulate a biting question. Of course, the attacked individual can provide a detailed explanation or try to refute the point leveled against them. A challenge such as this, however, requires a detailed explanation which, in this age of information overload and a lack of patience towards complex content, we can reasonably assume will fall on deaf ears. And once again, the path is paved for both mistrust in media institutions and social instability, this time assisted by AI technologies and sponsored by commercial companies keen on making big bucks.